So I recently saw a video going over why in anime, especially in isekai fantasy stories, the church is so often depicted as an evil and overarching antagonist. Whether it be they are overly controlling of their followers, or they have a deep or moral religious belief that the protagonist is a danger to their faith, or they're just straight up corrupt all the way down to the bottom. But this is an interesting dilemma, because it is almost exclusively the church, more specifically the Catholic Church, that is depicted as evil. Very rarely are other religions or sects of worship depicted in such a negative light. But that's not to say that the Christian imagery is only ever used in a negative light. Many series use Christian imagery just for the novelty of it, from actual dissections to direct allusions to the Bible in their stories. But it is also weird, where it feels more like a fake religion that got famous from a story. It almost feels as if the Japanese don't know that Christianity is an actual religion and are just using it willy-nilly. So I went to see if anybody else had been discussing the use of Christian imagery on YouTube. But there was literally nothing. No basic overview, just a bunch of channels discussing if or what anime were best for Christians to watch. And it is such a shame to see. Christianity is the largest religion in the world, literally being a third of the entire world's population. And with this large amount of people spread all across the world, surely there should be a video that discusses that. So that's what this video hopefully is. A not too long summary and explanation of why Christianity in anime is so often depicted in weird and negative ways. And before we start, I do need to preface that I myself am not a Christian. I mean, I am no longer a Christian. I used to go to a Christian primary school, so I learnt all the Bible stories and history during that time, with which I hope I can try to give an unbiased perspective into this topic, as I am no longer Christian as I stated, or believe in God. So let's have a look at why Japan treats and uses Christianity so weirdly. So let's start off with the beginning of Christianity in Japan. It first starts, like with all things, the Europeans. Back in 1543, a Portuguese trading ship was blown off course and landed on the island of Tanagashima, just south of Kagoshima in Kyushu. This marked the beginning of the Nanban trade period from 1543 going on for around 70 to 100 years. During this time, along with all the new guns that the Portuguese brought, Christian missionaries and ideas were also brought and introduced to the country, mainly from Francis Xavier in 1549, along with 3 Japanese converts, who started preaching across the country. Initially, the Japanese people thought that the religion was a new Indian faith, as Portugal had important ties with India at the time. Over time, most of the missionary work was transferred and done by the Jesuits, an order of Catholic men for the Vatican. Most of the converts were in Kyushu, as you would expect, with many elites and warlords converting, including Oruma Sumitada, Arima Yoshida, and Ottimo Sorin. Many of them were baptized, given Portuguese Christian names, and forced to adopt Western-style cultural habits. Along with this, the warlords and elites that converted, along with the missionaries, destroyed Shinto and Buddhist temples in their areas and persecuted their priests and monks, forcing them to marry, leave their lands, or renounce their faiths. Initially, the Christians enjoyed protection under Oda Nobunaga, along with his successor Toyotomi Hideyoshi. However, after conquering Kyushu and visiting Hakozaki, he learnt of the selling of Japanese slaves overseas in China, Korea, and Europe by the Portuguese, along with the persecution of Shinto and Buddhist monks, and the apparent forcing of people to convert to Christianity. So in response, he changed the country's policy on missionaries with the Batarin Edict, which specifically expelled missionaries from the country and only allowed black trading ships in. It also stated that commoners could freely practice the religion, but daimyo had to gain permission from the shogun. It also alleged that the missionaries had been involved in the selling of Japanese slaves along with the Portuguese. Another part of this, as at the time, the emperor, which wasn't actually in control, was seen as a direct descendant of Amaterasu, the sun god in Shinto, so Christianity directly contradicted the power system of the country. Scholars believe that Hideyoshi also believed that the Europeans were using Christianity to weaken Japan, convert its population, overthrow the government, and make it into a colony. During his rule, many missionaries in Japan were killed, mainly using Japanese-style crucifixions, the most famous of which was the 26 martyrs crucified and tortured outside of Nagasaki, one of the largest Christian populations in Japan, in 1597. These crucifixions continued for many years after, heading into the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate, which fully banned Christianity in 1614, with well-known crucifixions happening in 1613, 1622, 1623, 1630, and many other years. Then in 1638, after being oppressed and taxed to high heaven, a rebellion of both peasants and Christians occurred in the Shimabara domain, which is now modern-day Nagasaki. It is the largest uprising in Japanese history, with around 37,000 rebels taking on around 120,000 shogunate soldiers. However, unfortunately for the rebels, the shogunate responded brutally, massacring practically all 37,000 rebels. After which, most of the remaining Christians were either murdered, renounced their faith, or went into hiding, and it remained that way until 1873, when the Meiji government allowed it to be practiced under its Religious Tolerance Act. There is still more history to discuss, but for now, this will do, because now we roughly know the historical reason as to why Japan doesn't like or practice Christianity, but now we need to look at the more cultural aspect. The version of Christianity that Japan first encountered was the Portuguese version of it, of course, and at the time, the Protestant Reformation was in full swing in Europe, where the Catholic Church was being replaced with new denominations such as Lutheranism, Anabaptism, and Anglicanism. But Portugal and Spain were not part of the Reformation and honestly became even more Catholic, seeing themselves as the final bastion of true Catholicism against the heretical Protestants. And here, we need to discuss some things called inclusism, exclusism, and pluralism. These are terms that describe how religions perceive themselves and others and how they interact with those other religions. So for starters, Catholicism is an exclusivist religion, as only through their belief and way of worship can you hope to get salvation, and other forms of religions, even other denominations, are either only partially true or just straight up false. So only through active and continuous worship of God could you find peace in the afterlife, or in heaven. Then there are the inclusivists, which is similar as they hold that their faith is mostly the one true faith, but that other religions are not entirely wrong, and that active and constant worship is not entirely required. So they would see other churches and even other religions not as heretical enemies, but just some confused people. They also usually stipulate that just by faith alone in their religion is enough to find salvation, especially in the 7 Days Adventist Church. And more recently, the Vatican has also started to become more inclusivist, teaching you that you can still be saved even if you do not explicitly know the Bible or genuinely seek God in whatever form you want. And finally, we have pluralists, which can be described as similar to philosophical relativists, where it stipulates multiple religions can all be equally true and hold equally valid points to what is called ultimate reality. This is what you can consider the big final thing of reality. What is the deepest and truest part of it? So in Christianity, that is God. But in pluralism, it is either outright rejected as an idea or is interpreted as a thing with multiple equal paths to it. Pluralism also encourages harmony inside of society, arguing that all religions can coexist, all making their own different paths to this ultimate reality. So why do I explain all these different interpretations of religion? Well, it's due to the fact that Catholicism, which the Portuguese introduced to Japan, was exclusivist at the time, and Japan was a very pluralistic society. Catholicism postulates that God is the one true God, and all others are heretical fakes that you must not worship. And in contrast, the two most common religions in Japan, Buddhism and Shintoism, are much more relaxed with other religions and are both very much inclusivist. So when you get a country saying that all your religions are wrong, the ones that you have been using for centuries, and this new strange religion is the actual one you must follow, otherwise you are sent to eternal damnation, you can see why the Japanese did not take lightly to Christianity. And since Portugal was fighting the Protestant movement in Europe, they were extra eager to convert Japan to Catholicism instead of that heretical Protestantism. So that's why they were kicked out. However, you're probably asking, but why then were the Portuguese kicked out along with every other European power, except the Dutch? Why were the Dutch allowed to contact Japan during Shokoku? And it's not like the Dutch were not religious. Calvinism was the state religion at the time. Well, Calvinism is a Protestant religion, so the Dutch were not in any rush to convert the Japanese to Christianity, because Calvinism states only God can choose who can be saved. So if the Japanese were not chosen by God, why would you even bother trying to convert them? And secondly, remember the rebellion I talked about a while ago? The Christian uprising? Well, the Dutch actually helped the shogunate defeat the rebels, supplying supporting fire and handing over prisoners to the Japanese. So they didn't try to spread Christianity, and they also supported the shogunate in war. And they also, at the time, were busy inventing capitalism. So all they wanted to do was make as much money as possible. So they were the only ones allowed to trade with Japan. Alright, that's probably enough history for now, both cultural and actual. So let's look at the consequences of this history. First of all, Christianity has always been an underground religion in Japan, and as such, most of its imagery and traditions are seen as exotic things, the same way as we in the West see religions like Hindu or Sikhism. The Japanese don't have any idea of what it actually is meant to be, so most of the ideas about it are priests, nuns, the Vatican, and the Pope. And maybe they will talk about Jesus. They at least recognize that you have to be careful with the big man. So most writers use Christianity not to preach or criticize it, but because it is just a cool-looking religion from the far distant lands of medieval Europe. And that leads us to probably the most famous example of Christian and Jewish imagery in anime, Neon Genesis Evangelion. It is definitely the most famous anime with Christian imagery in it. It has its angels named after many actual angels from the Bible, including Ramiel, Seychal, and Sandalphon. And many of its other parts have Christian symbolism in it, such as the Tree of Life in the literal opening, which, if you didn't know, comes from a Jewish religious philosophy called Kabbalah. And with all this Christian stuff in it, you would think that the authors were very much either Christian or had a very good idea of what Christianity is. However, that is supposedly not the case. The creators have consistently stated the use of Christianity was purely an aesthetic choice, and any resemblance to actual religion is purely coincidental, and they never expected it to gain this much popularity outside of Japan. And from what we can see, it is definitely understandable. The angels are not shown as actual angels of God, but more in line with otherworldly demons coming to destroy the world. However, I find it funny, as did two researchers from the UK, whose paper I'm basing this argument on, that the religious imagery is, how to put it, concise. When they say they only used it for aesthetic purposes, it's almost impossible to believe them for me, because so much of the imagery and allusions are well thought out and implemented as well. Firstly, look at this symbol. I want you to guess what it is. I know you can't. Nobody can. I couldn't. It appears in episode 15 in the central dogma on the floor, and it shares direct elements from the symbol, the Lesser Key of Solomon, a symbol coming from a 17th century grimoire. I know, an actual magic book. And if you don't know who Solomon is, he was an incredibly powerful and smart king in the Bible, whose most famous story was the baby and the two mothers. Also, the information system, Maggie, composed of 3 supercomputers, is also quite deep in its Christian imagery. They each represent one aspect of Naoko Akagi, the mother of Ritsuko, being the scientist, the mother, and the woman. And their corresponding names are Melchior, Balthasar, and Caspar. And these 3 names also correspond to Christianity. This one is probably easier to guess, but they are the names of the 3 wise men that visited the birth of Jesus Christ. Now, this could be a coincidence, but I think it is too perfect to be that, because what the 3 men brought and symbolized correlate exactly to what each of the computers do. Melchior, the king, brought gold, which symbolizes wisdom, and the corresponding computer is the logical, wise, analytical one. Balthasar brought frankincense, which represents protection and purity, and the corresponding computer is the mother, offering protection and emotional responses, pure responses. And finally, Caspar brought myrrh, which is related to emotion and death, which is the corresponding computer, woman, which offers the most conflicting and emotionally charged decisions. And finally, these 3 men together are called the biblical Magi, just how the computer here is also called Maggie. Does this sound like the writing of someone taking Christian imagery from a basic fleeting glance, or someone who has actively researched what they are depicting? And the argument we never knew that it would get big outside of Japan is kind of also impossible to believe, because at the same time, Gainax was aggressively marketing themselves overseas, so they obviously knew that the show would eventually find an overseas market. It suggests that there are a lot more complexities to what the show is talking about, rather than just being random symbols. However, that's not to say that the show is secretly super Christian, and there is so much more symbolism to how God is amazing. I mean, Ava is an endless, bottomless hole of interpretation and symbolism, so this is honestly just another throw of water in the ocean. And I also want to get onto other topics, because we have so much more to talk about. So Ava uses Christianity and Judaism in a much more concise way, though stating that it was only used for being exotic. But what are some anime that use Christian imagery in a more exotic way, the way that Ava claims itself to be? That would be many anime, but the anime I'm going to use is Trinity Blood, or just Trigun with vampires. Trinity Blood, unlike Ava, is definitely inspired from Christianity and its stories, but it doesn't have the same depth as Ava. It feels the surface level. It takes place after Armageddon, a massive global nuclear war where the world was practically destroyed, with the story being set 900 years after it, where there are now two factions on Earth. The humans, led by the Pope in the Vatican, and the vampires, led by the vampire empress in Byzantine. However, the story is really liberal with how it uses its Christian imagery. First of all, there is a female cardinal. Now that might sound sexist to you, but in Catholicism, it is prohibited, or literally just not possible to have a female bishop or priest at all. The reason being is that priests are icons of Christ and serve as his will on earth during their sacraments. And since Jesus himself was male on earth, the male body is required to sacramentally represent him. Like the church, literally according to themselves, cannot appoint women priests, as they do not have that power. That power is with God. Some denominations do use female preachers and priests, but for Catholicism, which this show is most definitely based on, this would not be the case. Also, the story explores how not every vampire is evil and not every human is good, offering a more grey perception of morality. Now, I am all for having a subversion of tropes and stories, and how reality is often more complex than the clear-cut lines of good and evil so often taught in Christian teachings. However, in this case, it further shows how Japan believes in pluralism. By making everybody's opinions equally valid, it makes it more like the Christianity is just a lick of paint, rather than deep-level symbolism. Whereas in Ava, it is quite fucking clear who is evil and who is good. And it also shows Japan's Shinto Buddhist relativistic beliefs, where conflict of good and evil are only conventions, and can only be resolved by looking past them. What further shows this is the way that Lilith is depicted in this show. Now, even if you are a devout Christian, you have probably only heard of the name Lilith in passing when referring to Christian Judaism mythology. Well, she was, according to the Hebrew Bible, the original wife of Adam. However, she refused to submit to him on the grounds that she was made of the same earth as he was, and ran from the Garden of Eden. And when three angels, Senoi, Sansenoi, and Samagiloth, tried to get her to return, she retreated to the Red Sea and became the demoness associated with killing newborn babies, and only agreed to not kill babies that had a crest or some kind of symbolism of the three angels. Because of course, a person who just wanted to be treated equal to a man needs to be outcast as a child-murdering demon lord. Anyway, that aside, in Trinity Blood, she is depicted as a prototypical vampire hybrid, one that is incredibly caring for humanity and a brilliant strategist. She helped fight against the vampires during the Dark Ages, and was killed under a false truce. So the only similarities to that of the original Lilith is that of the name. I mean, I prefer this Lilith, honestly. So Trinity Blood is basically an edgy vampire show that pretends to know what Christianity is. But that's not to say that this show is bad in any capacity. It is good. It definitely has some aspects of it that I really enjoyed. Seeing priests shooting shotguns is always going to be cool, so I'm not going to fault it for that. And this show shows how Japan generally views Christianity. You will notice, out of everything I have talked about, that most of the anime utilized predominantly Catholic symbolism. Most of the characters and things are based on Catholicism, rather than general Christianity. In fact, nearly every show, the church is shown to be Catholic in their design, rather than Protestant. And the reason being is both because it is what Christian denomination Japan was first introduced to, so they had a predisposition to use Catholic imagery and iconography, but also because Catholicism is a much better thing to use for storytelling than Protestantism. There are so many different symbols and stories in Catholicism, from the existence of nuns, almost insane traditional rituals, and the other plethora of symbols. In the words of C.S. Lewis, the author of The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, Catholicism is a jungle of symbols, while Protestantism is a desert. And with this amount of symbols and Gothic aesthetic, it makes it much easier for authors to write a romantic version of Christianity, as Japan never really gained a large Christian population after its unbanning, so there isn't anything to use domestically, and it will also offend the least amount of people, as only around 1% of the population is Christian. For example, the most famous piece of fanfiction on the planet, The Divine Comedy, is absolutely full of symbolism and ideas, with many series just using it for the source material for what Christianity is. Like The 9 Stages of Hell, Satan being frozen in ice, putting Odysseus in the ninth stage of hell because, you know what, fuck Odysseus. That's not to say, though, that Protestantism has had no effect on Christian depictions in Japan. One of the most famous pieces of Christian literature, Paradise Lost, is a fundamentally Protestant piece of storytelling. And some of the most famous parts of modern Christian storytelling comes from it, such as instead of Satan always being some disgusting creature, he was more of an angsty anti-hero, where he was, in fact, explicitly said to be good-looking. Or how love can also be a means to turn you evil, like in Darth Vader's case. So for the most part, Christian anime is Catholic, but it has some aspects of Protestantism. Now, finally, let's look at the question that got me into this rabbit hole. Why is the church in anime being depicted so evilly? We know the reason why they so often use the Western church now, because it is an exotic religion that has an established iconography that writers can use, but for what reason is it always the church that is depicted as evil, rather than, let's say, a Shintoist monk? Well, for that, we need to look at even more history. Following the unbanning of Christianity and the abolishing of state Shintoism and worship of the emperor as a god, and just recently coming out of World War II, many people in Japan were feeling lost, having no place in the world. And as such, many religious cults took root in the country, many of them offering community and salvation that had been stripped from the country in recent years, while others said that the end of the world was about to happen, and you really had to join if you didn't want to die. And because Japan had just had 2 artificial suns dropped on them, many people were inclined to believe that what these cults were saying was actually true. And because most of the Japanese population was irreligious, they had no idea what actually dangerous cults looked like, compared to just normal religious sects. So many people ended up joining these cults, with many of them using a mix of Buddhist and Christian ideals. 2 of the most famous of which are the Unification Church and the infamous Aum Shinrikyo. Both of these cults utilized Christian teachings to some extent and had similar structures of power to what you would see in anime. However, you probably know of what happened with both of these religions. Now, I don't have time nor the fucks to explain another massive 2 historical events, but all you need to know is Aum Shinrikyo committed multiple acts of domestic terrorism utilizing sarin gas to murder their critics and enemies. And the Unification Church has been systematically exploiting its followers for years financially, and putting the 2 founders at the top of the religion, which spurred a man to assassinate Shinzo Abe in retaliation for allowing them to run unchecked. If you want more information, Aum Shinrikyo has multiple high-quality documentaries made about it on YouTube, and I recommend this video for the Unification Church history. Anyway, the main takeaway is that these religions imposed heavily restrictive conditions on its followers and manipulated them into doing heinous acts, and had incredibly corrupt power structures. And most of all, they taught Christian beliefs. Now, it is obviously not fair to treat Christianity as a completely evil religion just because of a few cults, but it is what happened. So in turn, many churches in anime are shown either being phony religions that exploit its followers for personal gains of the creators, or the power structures inside of them being used to kill or suppress characters in the show. And what these cults also did is reinforce the idea that foreign elements and foreign religions are evil inside of Japan. That's why Shinto and Buddhist characters are generally treated as good, or at least not evil, and Christian or foreign ideas are treated with more skepticism. And at this point, the church has gone through so much shit, they probably do not care that some guy called Subaru Tanaka wrote an isekai fantasy where the church used hot anime girls as slaves. So anyway, it would be stupid to say that this is the case without explicitly discussing and showing some actual examples. So what are some actual examples of this happening in anime? Well, let's start off with probably the most well-known example, Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. In the 3rd episode of the series, we see Edward and Alphonse dealing with a phony priest that has convinced the town to the power of himself and the sun god Ito, claiming that he is able to create matter and specifically revive the dead. Eventually, Edward and Alphonse reveal his plan, and he is killed by the later antagonists, Gluttony and Lust. This religion here explicitly shows the more corrupt and malicious side of religion, rather than the mania. Like with many cults, this church's only purpose is to further the plans and the powers of its leader, Cornello, and how they will ask for unrealistically large amounts of donations from followers. But in this case, it isn't even money, but their lives, as they believe Cornello can revive them, so there is nothing to fear when Cornello eventually enacts his plan to overthrow the capital. Many cults do this, where they promise something unrealistically attainable, such as glory in the afterlife or surviving the apocalypse, and then when the followers are practically dependent on them through multiple manipulation techniques, they use them to further their goals. And we see that with this church, where Rose is manipulated with the promise of reviving her lover into shooting Alphonse. Of course, she does not really want to kill them, but she has become so infatuated with the promise that she can see her loved one again through Cornelius that she followed his command. Another show that I think shows both heretical and corrupt power control and ulterior motives, all of which at the same time, is the Holy Western Church from Reincarnated as a Sly. Now, the church itself isn't inherently evil, or most of the followers are not inherently evil and want to kill everything. Many of them tolerate the monster's existence, or just leave the dealing of them to the holy knights. And the reason the church hates the monsters so much is, well, isn't it obvious? If there is a terrifying looking monster with special powers walking around, of course people are going to be scared of them. I mean, humans killed other people for believing slightly different things than they did, so of course the people in this world would be scared of the things that look most definitely not human. But it is still corrupt, both heretically and politically. They give Falmouth a reason to attack Tempest as it is a nation of monsters, something that cannot exist in God's perfect world, or because Falmouth wants better trade routes. So they abuse their position as a religious entity to give more power to another nation, which is definitely not something that happened in history. No. Then they also believe it was heretical that monsters can even make country, so they must be destroyed. Even though the literal leader of the church said, no, they are okay, leave them alone. They even manipulate their own high-ranking officers, like Hinata Sakaguchi, manipulating her to kill Rimuru and exhaust herself in the process, as she was too powerful and was at risk of revealing the church's true motive, which is collecting human blood for vampires that control it, who in turn are using the church. It's like 50 different levels of manipulation that can be boiled down to some people are being hungry. But the church utilizes its power to justify killing a group of people who are quite clearly not a threat and are quite innocent just because they threaten their conscience. And just like with Christianity throughout history, so many different sects have gone after each other just because they are a little bit different. Even today, people still argue which sects are even Christian enough to be even considered Christian. Anyway, I think that should be enough. So why does Japan use Christianity so weirdly inside their storytelling? Well, it's a combination of exoticism, lack of taboo culture around it, historical prejudice, and recent high-profile cases. And what we get are either nuns acting entirely sacrilegious, or we have churches so utterly corrupt, they literally start decaying from the inside out. There could be more for me to talk about here, but I'm pretty sure I've discussed everything there is to discuss here. And if there is anything I've missed or should discuss further, please leave your thoughts in whatever format you want down below. I'd love to see your opinions on this topic.